Welcome, everyone. We are very excited to have you at this webinar. My name is Bhavani Arabandi, and I'm a Principal Research Associate at Urban Institute, and I'm really excited you joined us for this webinar. I have a few housekeeping slides for your attention. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards. Speaker biographies and related materials are available online. All participants are muted, but you can type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time. We have a Q&A segment at the end of the session. You can also hide captions and adjust settings with live transcription. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Leslie Heisma, who will talk to us a little bit about the work we've done on this project.
Thank you, Bhavani, and welcome everybody. My name is Leslie Heisma. I'm a Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator here at Urban Institute, working on apprenticeship. And I'm going to start by setting the stage a little bit. So since 2015, the government has invested more than $1 billion in modernizing the system and expanding apprenticeships. In the past 2 years, DOL has positioned states to be the vehicle for apprenticeship growth, leading to more states investing within their own programs. Despite federal and state funding, apprenticeship remains underutilized. Our research examines the cost of scaling apprenticeships, strategic investments by states, and findings from a study of apprenticeship funding in Colorado. Scaling apprenticeship involves 3 different types of costs: program, expansion, and infrastructure. Program costs can range from $25,000 to $250,000 and depends on industry sector, occupation, length of apprenticeship, and wages. Expanding to new industries comes with costs such as industry-specific outreach, population supports, and supportive services. And it's important to note that since 2016, the federal government has invested over $800 million in scaling apprenticeships. Finally, infrastructure costs include building partnerships, outreach to employers, technical assistance for program development, and registration. One example of the kind of investments are the 4 technical assistance centers of excellence, including Urban's Registered Apprenticeship Center of Occupations and Standards of Excellence that developed gold standard national occupational frameworks, and the Registered Apprenticeship Standards Library. In the past 2 years, 28 states have pursued various funding, policy, and governance strategies to expand registered apprenticeship. These investments can be categorized into 3 buckets. Starting with employer and sponsor incentives, one way of incentivizing employers is providing funding to offset costs. Several states offer subsidies, tax credits, and tuition supports ranging from about $1,000 to $15,000. A few examples: in Colorado, businesses can claim up to $126,000 annually in tax credits for up to 10 apprentices. Businesses in South Carolina can receive $4,000 per apprentice or $6,000 per youth apprentice. And in Kansas, Kansas offers $2,500 per apprentice for up to 20 apprentices. Some states have focused efforts on investing into expanding opportunities, on broadening participation by investing in improving the participation of specific populations such as youth or justice-involved people. Another approach states have taken is developing funding opportunities to expand registered apprenticeship into sectors beyond the traditional trades. For example, teacher, childcare, or public service apprenticeship programs. And finally, streamlining apprenticeship infrastructure. States have also made large investments in the streamlining of apprenticeship infrastructure, including investments in intermediaries, funding new agencies to streamline workforce development, and improving processes. We conducted a case study of Colorado's funding landscape. We interviewed key Colorado stakeholders, including sponsors, state agency staff, as well as staff from local colleges to determine costs and funding needs of apprenticeship programs, available funding streams, and challenges within the funding process. Some of our key findings found the largest cost incurred by sponsors was labor in designing, marketing, and operating the program, while the largest need for funding was RTI, along with paying supervisors and mentors and supportive services. There was also a large need for technical assistance, for funding to develop programs, track participants, and manage those programs. The study also identified key barriers to accessing funding. On the sponsor side, we found that finding and navigating applications takes a significant amount of time and capacity because grant guidelines are often very restrictive. Some high demand grants often run out of funding quickly, so while programs may qualify and apply, they are not guaranteed the funding. And multiple funding streams may mean multiple expense tracking and reporting requirements, which can strain program staff. On the agency side, some of the barriers are because funding is housed in multiple agencies. Often staff rely on relationships with other agency staff for awareness. The availability and the amount of funding relies on administrative priorities at the federal and state levels and often can change. Accessing funds is difficult due to federal red tape and state procurement processes, which can deter eligible sponsors from applying. And there is often a lack of applicants for funding opportunities with specific criteria requirements, leaving funding unused. So despite apprenticeship being a value tool and receiving considerable investments, it's still a complex system to navigate and requires strategic investments. We have a few recommendations to streamline the funding landscape. First, starting with sustained and strategic funding. In order to scale apprenticeships, there is a need for more sustained and strategic investments rather than one-off grants and contracts at both state and federal levels. We recommend improved cross-agency collaboration. Collaboration between the state and federal government is necessary to create a range of funding opportunities without duplication. For example, federal funding could focus on launching the programs and state funding could focus on the management and sustainability of programs. We also recommend to match funding to needs, increase marketing and TA efforts for funding opportunities to help bring awareness and navigate eligibility and criteria requirements. And finally, we recommend to develop a tool to navigate funding. Develop a state-level tool that houses all public and private apprenticeship or workforce training funding opportunities in one place and can match applicants with eligible funding streams. And at this time, I would like to welcome my colleague Bhavani Arabandi back to lead a discussion on state-led strategies to apprenticeship expansion and innovation in Colorado, South Carolina, and Kansas.
Thank you, Leslie. That was really interesting and really appreciate all the information you shared. We have the paper linked on our event website, so I invite all of you to look through it when you get a chance. I now invite Denise Miller, Shonda Anderson, and Amanda Richardson to unmute yourself and come on stage, come online. May I ask you all to briefly introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'll start. Amanda Richardson, I'm the Vice President for Apprenticeship Carolina. We are a statewide intermediary housed within the South Carolina Technical College system.
I'll go next. I'm Denise Miller, who's unfortunately getting a call at this time. I'm the State Director of Apprenticeship Colorado, and we are the State Apprenticeship Agency. And I'll pass it over to my colleague, Shonda.
Yeah, hi, I'm so excited to be here. My name is Shonda Anderson. I'm the director for the Kansas Office of Registered Apprenticeship, and we are the state apprenticeship agency for the state and housed under the Department of Commerce.
Thank you all for being here, and it's incredible to have three amazing state leaders to kick off this conversation. So Denise, over the past 10 years, Colorado has significantly expanded its apprenticeship programs through new legislation and increased funding and a focus on emerging industries. And Shonda, you have overseen the largest increase in registered apprenticeship numbers and funding in Kansas history. No small feat. Kansas went from being the 47th in the nation to 26th in new apprentice numbers, and you are currently managing over 35 million in state and federal registered apprenticeship investments. And Amanda, similarly, South Carolina has substantial growth in its apprenticeship programs fueled by state and federal support. So here comes the question. Each of you have taken unique approaches to funding apprenticeships. So what funding strategies have been most effective in your state for scaling registered apprenticeships? And how do you ensure sustainability beyond short-term grants? Additionally, could you also speak to the role of state legislation has played, the role that state legislation has played in supporting or shaping these efforts? Denise, I'm going to kick it off to you to start.
Perfect. Thank you, Bhavani. So this is a great question because I think one of the things that Colorado has been really thoughtful about is thinking about all the different end users in apprenticeship. And by that, I mean, we have in funding, and whether you're talking about it from a legislative standpoint, whether you're writing a new grant, whatever your action is to sort of get to that funding stream, you have to think about what's your goal and who are you writing that, what's your intent, who are you trying to move the needle for? One of the things that we've thought about is we want to create quality, sustainable programs. So if you think about that as one of the end goals, you have to think about, all right, well, what is a quality, sustainable program and how do we build capacity for that program? And Colorado legislation, from a policy standpoint, from a financial standpoint, has reinforced over time different strategies to build capacity for programs themselves through investing in intermediaries, through creating multi-program sector strategies, and then really looking at tax incentives and other pilot strategies to really think about, okay, how do we grow this type of program and then measure it along the way? This has also been done through grant activities when there is a federal opportunity to sort of think about, okay, where and how do we want our programs to grow? And then how do we go ahead and think about reaching those programs and seeing if they're still open, 3 years later, 5 years out. When we think about apprentices, we want to make sure that they can participate in those programs. All Coloradans can participate in those programs, whether they're living in rural Colorado, urban Colorado, and how they might have the access to those quality programs. And so that means a combination of thinking about what types of funding are spread across the system, and then how could they have access and support to those funding. And then finally, our state agency, as Apprenticeship Colorado, the legislation that actually transformed us from a USDOL run state to a state agency was in itself a capacity builder, because we really need to have that capacity at the state level to play some of these coordinating roles and to be able to support employers and apprentices, sustainable programs. And then when we built that sustainable model out, we thought about, how do we support employers? How do we support apprentices? And how do we support the policy and communications to build out that infrastructure? And that was done with fiscal support, both through legislative activity and through grants and other braided funds from other agency sources.
Thank you. That was an incredibly thoughtful approach in response to that. And I have a very curious cat trying to get in on the webinar as well. So pardon that. Shonda, let me turn that to you, the same question to you about your investment funding strategies.
Yeah, I don't know that, man, that was a very good response, Denise. I think from a state of Kansas perspective, the Office of Apprenticeship or state agency has always been housed in commerce. We see registered apprenticeship as an economic developer, as a policy for economic development across the state. And so that's why we're in commerce, but we work very seamlessly with the Kansas Board of Regents or the Kansas Department of Education or the Kansas Department of Labor, those kinds of areas. But when we start thinking about registered apprenticeship, and I think even at the federal level, funding is not being flown through one particular department. It's coming at lots of different directions from lots of different departments. And the funding mechanisms are not only state legislated or funding from the state budget, funding coming from the federal budget, but also philanthropic funding. And so I think what I really like what Colorado has done, and I feel like Kansas has done as well, is really think about the audience. who is the audience that we need to bring, towards to develop out registered apprenticeships. And ultimately, you don't have a registered apprenticeship unless you have an employer, right? Because a registered apprenticeship is a job day one. It's a W-2 paid position day one. So the funding mechanisms that we've put out there to support our multi-employer intermediaries or group sponsors, to kickstart, small businesses, the tax incentives, those kinds of things, that's great, but they're intended to be coupons. They're intended to be cherries on top of the cake. The real value proposition and the area where we see the greatest length in time of use of a registered apprenticeship is really seeing the return on investment. And I think that's why Kansas has put money into developing out an ROI study just for Kansas to show employers the value proposition. A lot of employers we talk to already have the components of registered apprenticeship. They already have funding set aside for staff to go to college or to get additional training. It's a matter of bringing all those things together and legitimizing it. And then it's a matter of really trying to braid that funding mechanism. I think another thing that the state of Kansas has done really well is working with our local workforce boards and our higher education system, and getting our unions to talk to our local workforce boards, to talk to our higher education systems, to talk to our organizations, and really trying to find ways to braid all this different funding.
That's incredible. The kind of balancing act that you have to do all around.
Yeah, it really is a balancing act to make it make sense. And then I think the other thing that's really imperative is to have goals, trackable goals, that are then reported at the end of that funding mechanism. And that is something else I think Kansas does really well. So we know, the folks that we're investing in, we know those that are doing really well and the reasons why. We also know those that are not doing as well and the reasons why, and what learnings can we gain from that to make it better next time.
That kind of evaluation is so key to maintain that continuous improvement. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Amanda.
Yeah, so here in South Carolina, we've leveraged millions of dollars in federal funding over the past several years, which has really allowed us to expand our efforts by addressing those financial barriers wherever they may be. We've registered hundreds of programs and supported thousands of apprentices and pre-apprentices throughout that time frame. And those funds mostly support tuition dollars associated with the training, but they also help to support many of our operational needs, like staff, marketing, travel, and sponsorships. And as a result of those efforts, we can determine where our resources are best spent for the longer term and develop a more sustainable local funding strategy. As far as the legislature goes, we are very fortunate that we have a supportive legislature here in South Carolina who understand the benefits of registered apprenticeship, both for employers as well as for the workers. They supported the establishment of our organization back in 2007, and they have supported a substantial state income tax credit, just as you mentioned, that's available for participating employers. And they have also funded a one-time support for registered apprenticeships in youth and for small businesses here in the state. So.
That is a lot of information packed into that one question, but I do have other questions for you. So our report also highlights tax credits and subsidies as key levers, and all of you touched on some of that. But how have incentives such as tax credits or retention bonuses impacted apprenticeship participation in your state? Are there any lessons learned about what works and what doesn't?
I'll go first.
Sure, that sounds great.
So the state of Kansas, we passed legislation, what we call the CATAG funding, Kansas Apprenticeship Tax and Grant Act. It was really in three parts. So there's a for-profit tax incentive, there's a non-for-profit and healthcare grant, which of course we can't give tax incentives to nonprofits. And then there's an educator piece as well, where we're doing reimbursements for teacher education apprenticeship programs. I think that this is an area where we can always continuously improve upon. Developing and initiating tax incentives is hard. It's hard work. We have to go in and validate and verify, then develop the certificate and communicate that with the Department of Revenue. And the grants take, a little bit of time to get out the door. But I think overall, it has been very beneficial. We've seen significant growth in the state of Kansas. I mean, going from 47th to 26th in the nation in new apprentice numbers is great. Last year, we were up 34% in active apprentice numbers, 22% in new apprentice numbers. But the big thing that I think has been the most beneficial is that we're up 250% in active employers. So that also means employers that are now registered into the registration rapid system, that some are new coming in, but some we didn't know about before, and now we can communicate with them. And so that tax incentive helps. It creates that cookie, that coupon to get, more people on board to share their information, and allows us to communicate directly with them about additional benefits in apprenticeship, veteran benefits in apprenticeship, all the different things to get more of that engagement.
I can go as well. I think that's something that, again, we had to think through was realistically, our state budget is not massive. We don't have a very, by that I mean not at all. And our federal funds, we appreciate them, but we've noticed that with apprenticeship, a lot of times they encourage launch, but not necessarily sustainability. And so we've really had to think about, okay, what are we incentivizing employers towards, and how much are we like creating a commitment to registered apprenticeship? Because if we just say, yay, registered apprenticeship, and then all of a sudden employers are like, I thought we were in this together forever, and now
Right.
now I've like built my whole budget around this very complex like investment, and now you're just dropping off after a year
Yeah.
or 2 years with our funding commitment. It's really an investment from both sides. And so we had to think about, can we fulfill our funding promise, or all we're saying, we can give either leveraged funds from the state, short-term funding from the state. And so I think, like any relationship, you really need to think about transparency from the beginning with any employer relationship. You don't start and say, come to start an apprenticeship, and here's some money, and then we're going to walk away. And not that that's the intent, but I think that that's really where we try to go, is first with our customer service, which is what our staff provides from developing the program. They really want to understand, why are you developing this program? So they directly work with the employers to say, tell me about your, what brought you here. And when an employer only wants to start because they have like a financial incentive, it's almost a red flag, because do they understand the commitments and the long-term commitments of
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Yes.
That's one of those like, oh, but if they have I really have a workforce need, then it's like, how can we walk us alongside you and maybe give you some other resources, because they have to think through the long term as well. They need to think through the business sustainability. We have to say, oh, I'm glad you got that short-term federal grant or the tax incentive, just so you know that that's really limited, or it's competitive. You may not be eligible for it. Are you still in? And then we can have the next conversation and keep developing them. So I think it's really important to message. We have an incredible team called the Access team that just develops and builds a website that says, these are all the opportunities we know about. And they just have, and I know Kansas has something similar. This is what we know about, resource page that you can use. So that's part of we call it a service, a coordinating service. And our team is there. If you want to learn more, we can refer you to a partner agency. But we can't commit that we'll always be able to financially support you, but we're here for you to have that service for registered apprenticeship. We did launch a tax incentive last year through legislation. I think it's too early to see the impact, but there was huge demand, and that was focused on the new and emerging industries. And there was some great radio campaigns, and we're seeing a lot of impact from a pretty low cost radio campaign. So I think that there will be a great appetite from tax incentives, but again, it's really that appetite paired with the sustainability.
Absolutely. And you both bring up some very valid points and challenges that we see here in South Carolina as well. Not surprisingly, the state tax credit is something that immediately catches the attention of employers when we talk about the benefits of having a registered apprenticeship. And just last year, the legislature dramatically increased that per apprentice cap that the employer can receive. They added a retention credit and also added the ability for companies to carry that credit forward if they needed to. And we believe that this incentive has certainly increased interest in registered apprenticeship across the state, but it also adds a layer of complexity because the companies must complete and submit a form to another state agency, Department of Revenue, and that financial benefit isn't immediate. So we're still awaiting the most recent tax credit data, which will include the first year of the increased incentive. But interestingly enough, when we look back over the past 5 years of data that is available, only about 20 to 30 companies have claimed the tax credit each year out of approximately 1,000. So it is very underutilized. And while that tax credit does allow the companies to recoup some of their costs that they incurred, the grant dollars that I mentioned previously address training costs for the employer and or the apprentice. So between those two incentives, I would say that the grant dollars seem to have really been the most impactful in terms of utilization and prompting expansion. But of course, it is less sustainable and does present the challenge that you all mentioned already of the companies that receive the grant funding becoming reliant on those in terms of their sustainability as well.
I think all three of you really pointed out how incentives are both qualitative and quantitative. It's not just the one kind that, helps everyone across the board. Different employers, sponsors need different things to, start programs, build programs, manage them and sustain them. Those are all different kinds of buckets from which funds, need to come from. I really appreciate that thoughtfulness. Shonda.
Yeah, I was going to emphasize something that Denise said, that red flag, when the employers are coming to us and they're just coming for the incentive or just for the grant program, that's a major red flag. And we're very public about, if you're coming here for the grant funding, we don't want to work with you. It's not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be worth our time or your time. And ultimately, they're not seeing the true value proposition of registered apprenticeship as being a long-term workforce solution. And I think it's very interesting that historically registered apprenticeship has come from the union space, and a lot of unions have managed and maintained their apprenticeship programs for several generations without a lot of that kind of funding. It's really only been in the last 10 to 15 years that significant funding has really been put into the registered apprenticeship space. And being a state employee, I have to be a good steward of taxpayer dollars. So, really thinking through that and my fiduciary responsibility to the state of Kansas and the Kansans that are here is really important.
And I also wanted to echo something Amanda said. When you're interacting with another state or federal agency, you could try your very best to make simple paperwork, but another thing that I think our staff encountered and handles beautifully, and we do put communications, is you have to think carefully about your own role in this, because like when the IRA came out, the Inflation Reduction Act, it implicated registration agencies, but we're not tax advisors. And we would get very, very in-depth questions from employers about tax implications. And
Yeah.
I immediately had to think through this and say, what is this thing? And there was like a chat fire among all registration agencies in the country, because it's sort of a, you know, how do you make sure to give the best customer service? And one conclusion that we came to is you cannot say to every employer what their tax commitments are. And that's something that would be irresponsible to say, yeah, totally do it, because it actually could put the employer at risk. So it's
Right.
just, again, this like tension between bringing folks to the table, sharing those carrots, but also as a government employee, really thinking through what's the scope of our own agencies and what's the benefit for the employer, and let the employer decide, is that benefit right for me? Do I want to take on that benefit, whether that's apply for a grant or apply for a state credit, or do I want this just like standalone regardless? We want to register regardless, and then
Right.
we'll see what incentives we'll do down the line.
I really appreciate that effort in terms of, you know, having to pull back and as situations arise to assess them and go forward with what makes sense at this moment, given the information we have, to advise employers to the best of our ability, but also know where we cannot do something. You know, I think that speaks volumes. So just switching gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about participation. States are making strides to expand apprenticeship to new populations and geographies, and remove barriers to opportunity for underserved populations. So what investments has your state made to apprenticeships to make apprenticeships more inclusive for justice involved individuals, or people with disabilities, or women, or people of color, or, you know, opportunity youth? And what has been the impact of these investments? I mean, that is, so it seems like a very, you know, key theme here, right? It's one thing to, yes, make all these investments, but what has been the impact of these investments? And can you share any kind of data or success stories for us to, for the audience? Amanda, let's start with you.
All right, I'll go first. Because our organization serves individuals in all corners of South Carolina and all industries, our apprentice demographics closely represent our state's overall population. So as a result of that, we have traditionally had higher than average rates of women and minority groups in our apprentice population. However, we do have several programs that specifically address barriers for apprentices. So in South Carolina, we have used a portion of our federal funding to provide supportive service stipends for individuals who have financial barriers to either participating in or completing a registered apprenticeship or pre-apprenticeship program. And those funds can be used for things like childcare and transportation costs. We've also used federal funds to pilot a pre-apprenticeship program in one of our state's correctional institutions. So individuals are identified within a few months of their release date and put through a short-term training program taught by their local technical college. They will leave that facility with an OSHA 10 and Lean Six Sigma Yellow Belt credential that they can then take and leverage during their job search. We have sponsors who work directly with vocational rehabilitation. Most people associate voc rehab with individuals who have disabilities, and they do work with that population, but they also provide services to ex-offenders, veterans, and youth. So we recommend their services to all of our employer sponsors. And then finally, I'll just say that one of the keys to expanding apprenticeships in underserved populations is to really leverage the partners who work in those areas, both demographically and geographically. Many times you can fill a need that they have and vice versa. So, and of course, they may also have financial resources that are available to help support the joint efforts.
I can go. Sure. So I think, again, we had to take a step back as we launched. So when we, a few years ago, we were a U.S. Department of Labor state, and then we became a state apprenticeship agency. And one of the things that we were thinking about was who actually touches the job seeker and who works with the apprentice. And we concluded that that would never be us in the way like that a human services entity, a workforce center, a high school, a nonprofit organization. And so how does that then implicate or sort of what would be the relationship between us as a state apprenticeship agency and the individual job seeker or the individual apprentice while they're in their program, and or the graduate of the apprenticeship program. And so as we sort of thought through that, we said to get to all of those people, we really need an infrastructure that coordinates with partners more thoughtfully and also coordinates with those partner resources more thoughtfully. And so we have an access team, and that team really is focused on the customer service to the partners in the agent in the network, making sure they understand what a registered apprenticeship is. Having sort of a dating a program is interested, a partner is interested, they sort of match make between them. So there's a workflow, a back end workflow. There's making sure they have the opportunity to go to major partner conferences, like if all the CTE professionals or all the guidance counselors are meeting, they go to that to train them and to represent apprenticeship. They work on policy, like joint policy on the back end to make sure that we're speaking the same language. And they just then become more aware of each other's system to break down some of those barriers and communicate. With that, we've been able to have some then tweaks of legislation that didn't quite make sense. Different things that were like, oh, whoops, that went to education, but the way it was worded in education wouldn't work for an employer. So I think that's the kind of thing that can really move the system. And ultimately, one of the services that we do provide is always thinking about it from that employer perspective. So I think that an employer in a registered apprenticeship program is coming here for talent, and the job seeker is wanting to connect with a job. And so with that, we have these active employers through our registered sponsor network. They say, I want to start a registered program because I'm looking for a talent strategy. So now we have an active talent network that then we can connect the dots for the employers and say, here's a resource. They might still post on Indeed. They might still have a list. They have other recruitment strategies, but now they also have a unique network in their community that they didn't have before they started registered apprenticeship. It just creates options for them. And we're seeing great relationships happen at the community level, really organically that, maybe they were always in each other's backyard, but didn't really connect. Or they had meetings but didn't quite know the action item. And really, we see our access team as the bridge for that function. And another big piece and a strategy that is legislative is a strategy called a qualified apprenticeship intermediary. And we have those both in the industry space and in the talent space. And that's something our access team leads, is to sort of vet apprenticeship intermediaries, train them, collaborate with them, and then host events. There's like cool networking events, and then they sort of partner together. And then we're like, oh, you're having a cool event without us. And that's awesome, because then they're networking and sort of taking the lead on things in their own communities, their own regions, and connecting with their own programs.
I really appreciate how the connections that you make. It's not just your connection with the programs itself or the employer, the sponsor itself, but their connections with the community and the organizations within the community that sets them up for success. And I think that is a really, really key point in growing and broadening participation. Really, Shonda.
Yeah, I am when I first took over the office, this was in 2022, 21, I guess. I think we had to sit down and really rethink the focus of the Office of Registered Apprenticeship. We've been a state apprenticeship agency for several generations now, I think since the early 90s. But there was sort of an assumption that the office defined what other people's partnerships look like, right? And it's never great when government comes in and says, you need to work with this person and you need to work with this person to make this thing happen, right? That doesn't work. And especially in Kansas and in such a Midwest state, very independent state, very proud state. So we sat down and looked at what is the real purpose of the Office of Apprenticeship, right? And for us, it's three things. You know, number one, it's an information provider. It's a resource provider. We're going to teach our intermediaries what it is that they're to do. What are they legally obligating themselves to? How do they develop? How do they grow? How do they reach new people? I cannot possibly go out and talk to every employer across the state. Instead, I need apprenticeship champions that can go out and do this for me, for the office. We're also developing and providing resources of funding and things like that whenever we can. Number two, it's also providing a connection space, right? Create an opportunity for people to be able to talk to each other, to work with each other, and find those opportunities and those partnerships that that you wouldn't think of, right? That might make sense. And then number three, it's also staffing our Kansas Apprenticeship Council. We take our council very seriously. They have a role in program development across the state. They're a very diverse council, but they also have the ability to convene partners and bring people together and help set strategic directions for the office as well. So overall, I am not an expert in justice involved individuals. I am not an expert in disability individuals. I am not an expert, maybe a little bit more, in rural individuals, but I am a registered apprenticeship expert. And just as Denise said, bringing those partners that are experts in those areas together and show them the value proposition and walk them through the process, building that trust, building that relationship really helps make things happen. And ultimately, my staff and myself, and this is probably the one thing that I'm the most proud of that Kansas has been able to do, is we came into this role, I came into this role with a can't attitude. We can't do that. We can't develop a teacher educator apprenticeship program. Really? Why? Let's sit down and think through it. Let's break that barrier. I'm sorry, no, we can't develop a pre-licensure registered nurse apprenticeship program. But why? Like, what is the reason why? Let's sit down and think through it and commit ourselves to figuring it out and being able to move the needle. I think the biggest one that we've received is, I'm sorry, but registered apprenticeship just won't fly in rural Western Kansas. Really? Why? This year, we named American Implement our Apprenticeship Partner of the Year. They've gotten the highest award for registered apprenticeship in the state of Kansas. They've got several dozen registered apprentices in Garden City and Dodge City, Kansas, and some very western rural areas. And they're apprenticing 16, 17, 18 and up-year-olds on how to work on John Deere tractors. That is a major economic driver for that region. So no longer can people say, no, it just won't fly, or there's no interest. No, there's interest. We can make it happen. We will make it happen because we're going to break the barriers down and open up all the doors that you say are there and make something work. As long as it's high wage, high demand for the state of Kansas, we'll make it happen.
I love that. I love that change from can't do to can do, and why not, right? And how can we make this happen? I think that is important in all of this conversation. There's so many things going on here. So I know we're coming up on time, but I do have two questions for you, and I'm hoping to ask you to keep this next one a little brief. There's lots of work going on in the States. But how do you keep track of all this? What metrics do you use to evaluate, right? the success of your apprenticeship investments, and are there any surprising findings about cost effectiveness or long-term outcomes that you see?
I can jump into that. One of the things, and I'll keep it brief, is number one, we fall under the Kansas Department of Commerce. We see registered apprenticeship as an economic driver. The Department of Commerce has a strategic plan. It's called the Framework for Growth. That strategic plan identifies very specific industries that are the most important to the state of Kansas, industries that are already here, that are thriving and growing, and emerging industries that we want to grow even more. We've sat down to strategically align all of our registered apprenticeship programs, their NAICS codes, their RAPIDS codes, whatever, with those very specific industries that are important to the state of Kansas. So now we've got strategic alignment across the entire state. So we're watching that, and I'm running numbers pretty frequently throughout the year to figure out where we have growth in registered apprenticeship, where do we need growth in registered apprenticeship. We've had significant expansion in education and healthcare. I know that an area we need to focus on is advanced manufacturing. So how do we come up with tactics? Who do we work with to help grow those sector areas? The other thing that we did that I'm very proud of, I hope they put the link in there, is the return on investment study. The state of Kansas, there is a national study that a lot of people utilize, that $1.58 for every dollar invested. I've used it for 10 years. It's a great statistic. But Kansans are interested in what Kansans can do. So we need Kansas answers. And so we worked with the University of Kansas to develop a return on investment study to figure out what those attributes are for the state of Kansas. And we're actually going into a phase 2 of that study to start connecting wage data to our apprentices to understand what it's done for wages over time. How's that for short?
Perfect.
I'll just mention that in South Carolina, we're looking at lots of data. When you think about the funding, the investment from a state perspective, federal perspective, we're looking at how many apprentices were we able to serve with those dollars? What was the investment per apprentice? What were the credentials that they received as a result of that? And from a state and federal investment standpoint, you're considering that during this time, the investment that we paid towards their education and training costs is fairly minimal. And then when you consider that their wages are increasing throughout the course of that training, and at the end of the training, resulting in higher taxes, state and federal, that return is definitely there on the state and federal investments that we're making. So.
And then on Colorado's side, I think something that's really important is in our transition, we looked at our data and we realized, and I know some other states that have done this transition, that the data itself wasn't quality in Rapids. And so our first step was data quality so that we could do an ROI study, so we could get where Kansas is, so we could get where some other states are that are much older. And so our first few years, we're really focusing on data protocols, data cleanup, removing old programs, making sure existing programs know how to enroll and complete their apprentices. This has been a huge data effort of our incredible internal team, and it would be an area that if we had even more capacity in the state apprenticeship agency, I think that would be a very high impact area because of the breadth of work and the breadth of effort that it takes to maintain that quality, because it is not just the state apprenticeship agency, it's also the technical assistance for the sponsors and their employer partners to be able to actually build out that infrastructure for some of those key metrics that the state is interested in. So we're doing a pretty comprehensive map of aspirational metrics. And I think right now that's a plan. And right now our priority within the agency itself is to do data cleanup and validation.
I love the variety of responses here in terms of just the creativity that goes into tracking so many different things, right? I mean, from how employers are doing, the success outcomes of apprentices, what else is needed in terms of technical assistance. There is a lot of data, but also metrics to track, and I really appreciate all of that. So my last question, and if we can keep it to 30 seconds each, I know this is going to be hard. But looking ahead, which strategies will you double down on and which will be redesigned to meet future workforce needs?
Start with
Amanda?
South Carolina. Sorry.
Kick
I'll
us
just say,
off.
all right. We're always looking to remain nimble while staying within our scope to see how we can fulfill our mission most efficiently and most effectively. One of the things that I see us doubling down on a little bit are group programs. So we have some very successful models of industry-led and college-led group programs in South Carolina. And I think that model just makes a lot of sense. It allows the industry or the education provider to take true ownership of the talent development rather than putting it on the back of the individual companies. It also helps to centralize the administration of the program, making the individual businesses more willing to participate. So that's one area that I'm comfortable in saying we're going to be putting some effort into.
So in Colorado, one major influence that we've worked with is our State Apprenticeship Council. Our State Apprenticeship Council advises us on everything from policy to implementation, and they represent a wide group of stakeholders. We have a 25-person council that includes industry, unions, building and construction trades, new and emerging industries, qualified intermediaries, youth priority representatives from underserved populations, the whole gamut, as well as ex officio members that are from our state agencies. We're doubling down on how we strategically leverage their expertise and their networks to really make sure employer voice is driving all areas of apprenticeship, and making sure that we engage them in what this looks like on the ground. We have in a recent piece of legislation, alignment of registered apprenticeship with CTE or career technical education. And that includes a state level advisory council. And we're going to couple that advisory council with our registered apprenticeship, state apprenticeship council to really make sure there's alignment. Another piece that we have going on right now at our governor's office is really looking at that bureaucratic burden, the administrative burden, the funding hurdles that are just created through that the multiple agencies, multiple departments administering funding. And so our governor's office is really analyzing that through an executive order and making recommendations by December on how to streamline departments and really think through how we could best maybe reposition ourselves to structurally, essentially, administer some of these funding streams more effectively. And then I think that our last thing is just we have to think more strategically at the state level about how we apply for funding from other sources beyond state and federal sources, and we are seeing a huge impact in both industry and philanthropic partners. And so that is something that I see really coming to more cohesion at the state, and then really getting into different conversations with different types of funders.
So I could go on about relationship building, focusing on high wage, high demand, focusing on policy, focusing on procedure, all of those things, our council, all those things into the future. But I think that there has been massive, significant change within the state of Kansas over the last 4 or 5 years. When you go from a state of the 47th state in the nation to the 26th state of the nation, there's obviously something that's happening that's making things going forward. And so I want to just leave it with this. I feel very strongly that for any kind of organization, whether it's government, business, whatever, having a strong vision and mission statement are absolutely key. That's what sets the strategic direction forward. That's what gets everybody in, the same track, on the same trail, headed in the same direction. And we set a very strong mission in 2022 to meet the needs of the Kansas economy and its citizens. The Office of Apprenticeship will actively grow a robust system that supports our apprenticeship stakeholders, sponsors, intermediaries, and apprentices. We do this by strategically empowering partnerships that serve a diverse and inclusive workforce through occupational proficiency for generations to come. And at the end of the day, every decision we make, everything we do, every email we write, every interaction that my staff have, that the council have, that any of our intermediaries have, that mission statement is first and foremost. We also set a vision to grow Kansas apprenticeship to a top 25 state by 2025. We hit 26. That's pretty damn close. And I'm very proud of us, and I will shout it to the rooftops. And what we're doing going forward is coming up with that next vision statement. What is it that we want to be? What do we want to look like? Who are we wanting to impact? What is that? How do you define that for the state of Kansas? So I don't know what that is yet. We'll find out in the next couple of months, and we'll definitely let you know.
Well, thank you so much for an incredible discussion. And I know I did not ask you any easy questions. Those are all very, two-part questions and all. We have a lot of audience questions, and I know we will not get through all of them, and I'm happy to share them with you later on. But one thing I want to get at is, one of the questions that came in was, how are you working with CTE and high school students to expand recruitment efforts for, students below 18 years? And have you run into barriers with employers, especially construction, setting their minimum age standards, and also have questions about liability? So if anyone wants to kick this off, Shonda, I see you nodding, so go for it.
Yeah, so this is a fun one. And I will tell you that I'm gonna give a big challenge to the state of Kansas. We can do this, and we can do this so much more aggressively than we are doing this right now. So any Kansans that are on the call right now, you call me, let's sit down and chat through this. Again, it's that barrier breaker conversation. We've been told for years that workers' compensation laws, that it is illegal to hire a 16 and 17-year-old to do a hazardous occupation job. It's not illegal. It's a business decision. But employers don't like to hear that because their workers' compensation insurance providers, that's the easy answer. It's scary to hire a 16 and 17-year-old in construction and in manufacturing. Heck yes, it is. Of course it is. But we worked very diligently with the Kansas, the governor's office, with our Department of Labor, and then also with our insurance commission to define a letter. And I think they're going to throw it into the chat, to define a letter that gives employers something tangible to provide their HR systems, their lawyers, their insurance companies, to say, hey, you can't tell me this is illegal anymore. It's not illegal. Kansas follows federal child labor laws, but it is a business decision. Let's sit down and figure this out and find out what we want to do, because we do have counties across the state of Kansas that are at a 0 to 2% unemployment. They have to be thinking differently about how to attract and, more importantly, retain young people in our state. And this is a great solution to make it happen.
I mentioned this before, but we had legislation to mandate alignment between registered apprenticeship and CTE. So we had two positions, parallel positions, one in the apprenticeship agency, one in the community college system, hired under legislation. And that includes the focus on developing state level frameworks that districts and employers can adopt. It includes that advisory council, that's CTE and registered apprenticeship experts. So it's really like, let's go there. It's hard. We know it's hard, but we're going to go there. And then I think dispelling those myths and having that communication network, making sure we're going to the CTE professionals and the businesses. And then we've already seen employers want this, and we start with the ones that want this. So we don't have to force employers that are not, this isn't their area of interest. There's ample employers that have said, how do we hire youth? So let's start with those, and really sort of move the needle there. And we do see that focus both in the CTE space, but also in the outreach space. So there may be a high school completer, a high school that's graduating. So that's a different partnership and a different strategy that we're working on at the state, through a large partnership that we have, both with the U.S. Department of Labor and our partners at CareerWise USA, and several partners throughout the state, to really think about not only the CTE piece, but how do we do outreach, and connect the dots for high school students all across from the time they're 16 all the way through post-graduation for all of the registered apprenticeship opportunities. And so really excited about the future of that project. It just launched at our recent NASTAD conference, and that's called the Future Ready Apprenticeship Center, or the center. So can put
Thank
that.
you. Yeah, thank you. Amanda?
Yeah,
So sorry. Yeah.
that's okay. I'll just briefly say that our regional consultants have relationships with their local school districts, high schools, CTE centers. We do run into barriers with age, primarily in the manufacturing and healthcare sectors. Just as Shonda mentioned, sometimes those are perceived barriers, and sometimes those are self-restricted by company policy and can be adjusted. So we have seen some of that. In cases where the age is not negotiable, sometimes we will have companies distinguish on their apprenticeship standards between the tasks that the apprentices can complete before they turn 18 and what they must wait on until after they turn 18. So they don't necessarily want to wait to hire the individual or wait to put them into the apprenticeship, but they may still have some things that they say, we're not comfortable with this apprentice completing until after they turn 18. And in terms of employers, I always encourage folks to start with those advisory council members at the CTE Center who have already said, I'm willing to hire your students, because you know that is likely not to be a barrier for them. So.
I love it. I love these responses. But thank you so much for an incredible conversation. Really appreciate your time. And I encourage the audience to connect with your state offices. As Shonda said, connect with them to really respond to the rest of your questions. Thank you so much, Denise, Amanda, Shonda, for an incredible conversation. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.